In classrooms across America, teachers are entrusted with extraordinary responsibility. They are expected to guide, protect, and shape young minds during some of the most vulnerable years of a person's life. When that trust is violated, the damage often extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. At Central Valley High School near Spokane, Washington, that trust was broken when a teacher who was 23 years old at the time admitted to engaging in an illegal sexual relationship with a male student who was still a minor. The student was 17 years old at the time. The case itself drew public attention when it first emerged, but nearly 2 years after the court proceedings concluded, new details resurfaced, text messages exchanged between the teacher and the student that were later made public. Their release reignited unease, reopening questions about accountability, power, and whether justice had truly been served. The messages did not introduce new charges, nor did they alter the legal outcome. Instead, they revealed the emotional and psychological contours of a relationship that should never have existed, communications shaped by imbalance, secrecy, and authority. For many who read them, the delayed disclosure made the case even more unsettling, underscoring how long the consequences of abuse can linger, even after a sentence has been handed down. This is the story of McKenna Kindred, a former teacher, and a crime defined not by spectacle, but by betrayal. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel. Also like, share, and drop your thoughts on the comment section. We value your feedback and interactions. Central Valley High School serves students from the Spokane Valley area, part of a larger school district known for emphasizing academic achievement, extracurricular involvement, and community engagement. Like many public high schools, it relied heavily on the professionalism and ethical conduct of its staff. Teachers were not only educators, but daily authority figures, adults whose words and actions carried significant influence over students navigating adolescence. McKenna Kindred was employed at the school as a teacher, a role that placed her in direct contact with students on a routine basis. Colleagues and administrators, by most public accounts, initially viewed her as a professional member of the faculty. There was no early public indication that her conduct would later become the subject of criminal proceedings. Within a school environment, boundaries between students and teachers are not optional, they are foundational. Codes of conduct, district policies, and state laws exist precisely because minors are not on equal footing with adults who grade their work, control classroom dynamics, and serve as authority figures. These safeguards are designed to prevent exploitation, manipulation, and harm, especially when emotional vulnerability is high. In Washington state, as in the rest of the United States, sexual relationships between teachers and enrolled students are explicitly prohibited by law, regardless of the student's perceived maturity or willingness. Consent, in a legal sense, does not exist in such circumstances. The power imbalance alone renders the relationship unlawful. It was within this framework that Kindred's conduct later came under scrutiny. The relationship at the center of the case involved a male student who was a teenager at the time. While details about his identity have rightly been withheld from public reporting, court records and media coverage confirmed that he was legally a minor when the inappropriate relationship occurred. The secrecy surrounding the relationship and the length of time it continued became central elements in the investigation that followed. When allegations first surfaced, they sent shockwaves through the school community. Parents questioned how such conduct could occur unnoticed. Students struggled to reconcile the image of a trusted teacher with the allegations being reported. Administrators faced the task of responding not only to law enforcement, but to a public demanding transparency and accountability. For many observers, the case raised uncomfortable questions. How are warning signs missed? What safeguards fail? And why do some cases result in outcomes that feel disconnected from the severity of the betrayal involved? These questions would only intensify years later when private communications between Kindred and the student were released into the public record. Although the legal case had concluded, the story itself was far from over. The student at the center of this case was a teenage boy enrolled at Central Valley High School at the time the relationship occurred. Public records and responsible media coverage have avoided releasing his name, and that anonymity is intentional. In cases involving sexual misconduct by authority figures, protecting the identity of minors is essential, not only as a legal safeguard, but as a recognition of the lasting impact such exposure can cause. At the time of the relationship, the student was legally underage. He was navigating adolescence within a structured environment where teachers held power over grades, discipline, and access to opportunities. Like many students, he spent a significant portion of his daily life under adult supervision, trusting that the boundaries in place existed for his protection. There is no public evidence suggesting the student sought attention or initiated an inappropriate dynamic. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of teacher-student abuse cases is that responsibility rests entirely with the adult. The law does not recognize mutuality in such situations because minors cannot consent to relationships with those who hold authority over them. Psychologists and child safety experts have long emphasized that teenagers may misinterpret attention from authority figures as validation or care, particularly during emotionally formative years. This vulnerability does not imply fault. Instead, it underscores why teachers are trained to maintain strict professional boundaries. In this case, those boundaries were crossed. Before we continue, do you think that a 23-year-old was too young to teach in high school? Let me know your thought in the comment section. Based on court records and investigative reporting, the relationship between McKenna Kindred and the student did not begin with a single, obvious violation. Like many cases of abuse involving authority figures, it followed a pattern of gradual boundary erosion, often referred to as grooming. Grooming does not require physical contact. It frequently begins with increased attention, personal conversations unrelated to schoolwork, and communication that shifts from public or professional settings to private channels. Over time, what might initially appear as mentorship or concern can evolve into dependency and secrecy. In this case, communication between Kindred and the student reportedly moved beyond appropriate teacher-student interaction. The use of private messaging created a space where oversight was absent and accountability diminished. While the exact progression remains partially shielded by privacy protections, investigators later determined that the relationship became sexual while the student was still a minor. What makes such cases particularly troubling is not just the illegal conduct itself, but the imbalance of power that defines every interaction. Teachers are trained adults. Students are not. Even when a minor appears compliant or emotionally attached, the responsibility to prevent harm rests entirely with the adult. The relationship remained hidden for a period of time. As is often the case, secrecy was a central element. When misconduct occurs in isolation, away from colleagues, administrators, and parents, it becomes harder to detect and easier to rationalize internally. Eventually, however, the situation came to light. Nearly 2 years after McKenna Kindred's sentencing, text messages exchanged between her and the student were released to the public through court records and reporting. Their release did not change the legal outcome of the case, but it dramatically altered public perception. The messages themselves were not graphic in published accounts, nor were they released for sensational purposes. Instead, they offered insight into the nature of the communication between a teacher and a student, communication that should never have existed. For many readers, the messages confirmed what court documents had already established. The relationship was not a brief lapse in judgment, but an ongoing violation sustained through private contact. The tone of the messages, as described in reporting, reflected emotional familiarity and secrecy, hallmarks of inappropriate adult-minor relationships. The delayed release of the messages intensified public reaction. To some, it felt as though the full truth had only just emerged. To others, it reopened wounds that had not fully healed. Parents, educators, and advocates for child protection questioned why such material had not been widely known at the time of sentencing. The resurfacing of the messages reignited debates about transparency in the justice system and the role of public accountability in cases involving abuse of authority. Once allegations reached law enforcement, an investigation was initiated. Investigators reviewed communications, interviewed involved parties, and worked to establish a clear timeline of events. The key legal question was not whether the relationship was consensual in an emotional sense, but whether it violated state law. In Washington state, Sexual contact between a teacher and a student enrolled at the same school is illegal when the student is a minor. The law exists to remove ambiguity and prevent exploitation, regardless of circumstances. The investigation concluded that Kindred had engaged in illegal conduct. She was charged with 2 misdemeanor counts related to sexual misconduct with a minor. These charges reflected the statutory framework under which the case was prosecuted. Rather than proceed to trial, Kindred entered a guilty plea. The plea acknowledged the illegality of the relationship and brought the case to a formal legal resolution, but not without controversy over what would follow. When the case against McKenna Kindred entered the courtroom, much of the factual groundwork had already been laid by investigators. The legal process was not centered on debating whether the relationship had occurred, but on determining responsibility and appropriate consequences under Washington state law. Kindred chose to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges. A guilty plea, in cases like this, serves multiple purposes. It spares the victim the burden of testifying in open court, brings the case to a conclusion more quickly, and formally acknowledges wrongdoing. At the same time, it removes the opportunity for a full trial, where evidence and testimony might otherwise be examined in greater public detail. During the proceedings, the court recognized the defining feature of the case, the imbalance of power. Teachers occupy a position of authority that carries legal and ethical obligations. The student's age and status were central to the charges. The law does not weigh emotional attachment or perceived willingness when a minor is involved. It evaluates conduct through the lens of protection. Prosecutors outline the nature of the relationship and emphasized that it occurred while the student was underage and enrolled at the same school where Kindred taught. The defense, as is common in such cases, focused on mitigation rather than denial, highlighting cooperation with authorities, the absence of prior criminal history, and acceptance of responsibility. The court ultimately accepted the guilty plea. The sentence handed down would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. McKenna Kindred received no jail time. Instead, the court imposed penalties consistent with misdemeanor convictions, including mandatory registration as a sex offender for a period of 10 years. She also faced professional consequences, including the end of her teaching career within the district. From a legal standpoint, the sentence fell within the range allowed by statute. From a public standpoint, it provoked immediate and lasting controversy. For some observers, the absence of incarceration felt disproportionate to the seriousness of the offense. The idea that a teacher could admit to an illegal sexual relationship with a minor and avoid jail time challenged deeply held expectations about justice and deterrence. Others pointed out that sentencing guidelines for misdemeanors limit judicial discretion and that plea agreements often reflect a balance between punishment and procedural realities. Still, the outcome left many unsettled, particularly advocates for child protection who viewed the case as emblematic of broader systemic failures. The requirement to register as a sex offender carried long-term consequences. Registration affects housing, employment opportunities, and public reputation. It is intended as both a monitoring tool and a deterrent. Yet critics questioned whether this measure alone adequately addressed the breach of trust inherent in the crime. At the time, the case faded from headlines as legal proceedings concluded, but the sense of unresolved accountability lingered. Before we continue, let me know your thought. Do you think that the teacher deserves a harsher punishment for her action? Would the punishment have been the same if the offender was a man? Do well to like and subscribe button if you haven't. Public response to the case unfolded in waves. The initial revelation of the relationship sparked shock and anger within the Central Valley community. Parents expressed fear and frustration, questioning how such conduct could occur within a school entrusted with their children's safety. As details emerged about the sentence, reactions intensified. Social media platforms, local forums, and opinion columns reflected a sharp divide. Many commenters argued that the punishment was too lenient, particularly given the age of the victim and the role Kindred held as a teacher. A recurring theme in public discussion was the perception of unequal treatment. Comparisons were drawn to cases involving male teachers, where sentences were often harsher and public condemnation more severe. While each case differs legally, The contrast fueled debate about gender bias in how teacher-student abuse is prosecuted and punished. When the text messages resurfaced nearly 2 years later, public reaction reignited. For some, the messages reinforced the belief that the original sentence had failed to capture the gravity of the conduct. The delayed disclosure felt, to critics, like a missing piece of the story, one that should have been fully visible from the beginning. The renewed attention also placed pressure on institutions, courts, school districts, and media organizations alike. The Kindred case did not exist in isolation. Across the United States, cases involving teachers and students periodically surface, each prompting similar questions about oversight, prevention, and accountability. Research into educator misconduct consistently highlights patterns: private communication channels, gradual boundary violations, and institutional reluctance to confront allegations early. In many cases, warning signs are subtle and easily overlooked until harm has already occurred. School districts have implemented policies aimed at reducing risk, restrictions on one-on-one interactions, monitoring of digital communication, mandatory reporting training. Yet enforcement varies, and no system is immune to failure. The legal framework also plays a role. When offenses are classified as misdemeanors, sentencing options are limited. This can create outcomes that feel disconnected from public expectations, even when courts act within the law. The broader conversation extends beyond punishment to prevention. Experts emphasize the importance of clear boundaries, student education about appropriate conduct, and systems that encourage reporting without fear of retaliation. The Kindred case became part of this larger narrative, a reminder that authority, when misused, can cause lasting harm even in environments designed for learning and growth. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't. Also like, share, and drop your thoughts on the comment section. The conclusion of the legal case against McKenna Kindred did not mark the end of its consequences. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a longer, quieter aftermath, one that unfolded away from courtrooms and headlines, affecting individuals, institutions, and public trust in subtle but enduring ways. For the student at the center of the case, the impact cannot be measured by court documents alone. While the legal system addressed the crime in terms of statutes and sentencing, the emotional and psychological consequences of such an experience often persist long after legal closure. Experts in trauma and adolescent development emphasize that when a minor is involved in an inappropriate relationship with an authority figure, the harm is not always immediately apparent. Feelings of confusion, misplaced responsibility, guilt, or shame can emerge over time, especially as the individual matures and gains a clearer understanding of the power imbalance that existed. The release of text messages years later risked reopening those wounds. Even when identifying details are withheld, renewed public attention can re-traumatize victims by forcing them to relive experiences they may have worked to process privately. This is why many advocates argue that the public consumption of such cases must be handled with restraint and purpose, rather than curiosity. The victim's anonymity has been preserved, and rightly so. The responsibility for the crime lies solely with the adult who violated the law and the trust placed in her. Protecting the victim's identity is not about secrecy, it is about dignity. Central Valley High School, like many institutions implicated in cases of educator misconduct, faced scrutiny not just for what happened, but for how it happened. Parents questioned whether warning signs had been missed or dismissed. Administrators were forced to review internal policies, reporting procedures, and staff training protocols. Even when misconduct occurs outside the immediate awareness of a school, its discovery can erode confidence in the system as a whole. Schools depend on trust between educators and families, between students and administrators. When that trust is damaged, rebuilding it requires transparency and sustained effort. In response to cases like this, districts often reinforce policies governing staff-student interactions, particularly around digital communication. Training sessions on professional boundaries and mandatory reporting may be expanded. While such measures cannot undo past harm, they are intended to reduce the likelihood of future violations. For McKenna Kindred, the aftermath included the permanent loss of her teaching career within the public education system. A conviction involving sexual misconduct with a minor effectively closes the door on future employment in schools and many other professions involving trust and supervision. Sex offender registration imposed additional long-term restrictions. Registration requirements vary by jurisdiction but often include limitations on residence, employment, and travel, as well as ongoing monitoring. These consequences extend well beyond the initial sentencing period. While some members of the public viewed these outcomes as insufficient, others pointed to them as evidence that the case carried serious repercussions, even without incarceration. The tension between these perspectives reflects a broader societal struggle to reconcile legal frameworks with moral expectations. Perhaps the most far-reaching consequence of the case was its effect on public trust, not just in one teacher or one school, but in systems meant to protect minors. When authority figures abuse their positions, it forces communities to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability and oversight. Parents may become more cautious. Students may become more guarded. Educators who adhere to ethical standards may find themselves under increased suspicion. The resurfacing of the text messages amplified this effect. The passage of time did not dull the sense of betrayal. Instead, it underscored how long such cases can linger in public consciousness, unresolved in the minds of many. Although the court proceedings concluded years earlier, the Kindred case continued to resonate because it touched on fundamental issues: power, trust, and accountability. It served as a reminder that justice is not experienced solely in verdicts and sentences, but in whether communities feel protected and heard. For victims, closure is rarely tied to legal milestones alone. For institutions, reform is an ongoing process. And for the public, awareness remains one of the most powerful tools for prevention. The McKenna Kindred case, like many involving teacher-student misconduct, raises questions that extend far beyond individual culpability. It challenges communities, educational systems, and society at large to reflect on how authority is exercised, how accountability is enforced, and how young people are protected from those entrusted with their care. As we continue with the rest of this story, please share this story to your communities and platforms to create awareness for parents and guardians. We need to be more vigilant against sex predators. Authority carries inherent responsibility. Teachers are granted significant power, not only over students' academic progress, but over their emotional well-being and social development. That authority comes with ethical and legal obligations designed to create a safe learning environment. Violating those obligations constitutes not just a legal offense, but a profound breach of trust. In this case, the adult's actions leverage the imbalance of power inherent in the student-teacher relationship. Even when an interaction appears emotionally reciprocal, the law and ethics recognize that minors cannot consent to sexual relationships with adults in positions of authority. Consent is not merely a matter of willingness. It is defined within a framework of protection that exists precisely because power imbalances can distort judgment. The Kindred case demonstrates the consequences when authority is misused. The legal system responds, professional consequences follow, and public trust erodes. Yet the effects ripple far beyond formal sanctions, affecting the victim, the school community, and societal perceptions of safety and fairness. Legal accountability in cases like this often focuses on the framework established by statutes and precedent. McKenna Kindred pleaded guilty to misdemeanors and was required to register as a sex offender for 10 years, a sentence within the statutory limits. From a procedural standpoint, the courts upheld the law. But the public debate surrounding the case underscores a tension between legal outcomes and societal expectations. Many observers view misdemeanor sentencing for sexual misconduct with a minor as insufficient to reflect the harm caused. Others point out that the law defines what constitutes criminal responsibility, and courts are bound to operate within those constraints. Accountability, therefore, operates on multiple levels. Legally, the state determines whether a crime occurred and imposes penalties. Professionally, institutions enforce ethical and contractual standards. Morally, communities grapple with whether justice feels served and whether protective systems are adequate. The challenge lies in aligning these layers of accountability to ensure that the consequences are both fair and effective, and that the safety and dignity of minors are never compromised. At the heart of the case is the principle of safeguarding minors. Schools, parents, and society as a whole share responsibility for creating environments where children are protected from exploitation. Policies governing teacher conduct, communication monitoring, and reporting mechanisms are essential tools. Yet no policy is effective without vigilance, enforcement, and education. Experts emphasize several key practices for prevention. Clear boundaries. Adults in authority must maintain professional relationships at all times, recognizing that even well-intentioned interactions can be misconstrued or abused. Education. Students should be informed about appropriate conduct and encouraged to speak up if they feel uncomfortable. Monitoring and reporting. Schools need transparent reporting structures and monitoring systems that allow for early detection of boundary violations. Community involvement. Parents, guardians, school boards, and religious institutions play an important role in oversight, communication, and fostering a culture of accountability. The Kindred case illustrates what happens when these safeguards fail or are circumvented. It is not only a story of an individual's misconduct, it is a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the importance of proactive protection. Cases of this nature also prompt reflection on how society evaluates harm, intent, and justice. Ethical questions emerge. How should communities respond to adult misconduct with minors? How can legal systems, schools, and families collaborate to prevent harm before it occurs? And how do we balance the rehabilitation of offenders with the protection and healing of victims? While the law addresses specific acts, ethics demand that society consider long-term effects, psychological, social, and cultural. Each breach of trust invites scrutiny, not only of the individual, but of the systems and relationships that allowed it to occur. Thank you for watching to the end. What are your thoughts? Do you think that the teacher's punishment for her action was fair enough? Do you think that there should be harsher punishment for sex offenders in the USA, more than what we have today? Please let's continue this conversation in the comment section. Let me know where you are watching from. Subscribe if you have not done that yet. Thank you.